In this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts on using the Fujifilm GFX100 for wildlife photography. Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. Let's talk about the Fujifilm GFX100. A big thank you to Fujifilm for lending me this gear so I could evaluate it. When I do camera reviews, I am trying to do them a little bit differently to a lot of the camera reviews you might see on YouTube. I'm not spending a lot of time going into detail on technical specs or doing technical comparison tests. You can find a lot of this stuff in other places. As I mentioned in a recent video, I feel that the thing that matters in a lot of cases is the overall experience of something, such as using a camera or a camera system. And so for that reason, this is more an experience report than anything else. However, I will talk about some of the details and I will show you some images later on. I will do 4 things in this video. The first is I will give you a quick introduction to the system, and that might be useful, especially if you don't know anything about it. I'll talk about 3 things that interest me in terms of wildlife photography and using this system and why I started to look at it. I'll talk about 3 things that impressed me and 3 things that I think need some improvement. So let's get started. All right, the Fujifilm GFX100 is a very interesting camera for many reasons. The first is that it has a sensor that is bigger than a full-frame sensor, but it's smaller than the medium format sensors that you find in cameras such as those from Phase 1. Fujifilm have been calling this a large format sensor. And the sensor is 1.26 times bigger than a full-frame sensor. So let me give you a look at this. There's the sensor there. And as you're looking at that, let me pull up my Sony full-frame camera. This is an A7R4. It has a full-frame sensor, and so you can see the comparison there, full-frame and the large format sensor from Fuji. So the sensor is 1.26 times bigger than a full-frame sensor, and this means that the crop factor is actually less than 1.0. We're used to seeing crop factors that are 1.5 or 1.6 or 2.0. 0.79 is unusual, and what this means is that when you have a lens such as this telephoto prime in the GF system, this lens is a 250mm f4. In full frame equivalent terms, it would be like shooting with a 198mm f3.2. When you have the teleconverter on it, the 1.4x teleconverter on it, which I have on there right now, and this is mostly what I shot with, this is equivalent to 277mm in full frame terms. The 2 other lenses that I tested with this system are this what you might call a portrait lens. It's a 110mm f2, equivalent in full frame terms to a 87mm f1.6, and this wide angle, which is a 23mm f4, equivalent to a 18mm f3.2. So what are 3 things that are interesting about this system? Well, the first one is one that's probably pretty obvious, and that is resolution. 102 megapixels. That's crazy. Now, I made a video some number of months ago before the Sony A7R4 was released, in which I talked about high resolution sensors and what I think they might mean for the wildlife photography game in terms of disrupting the gear that we use. Those of us who are shooting with cameras now, like the A7R4 with its 61 megapixel sensor, know that that kind of resolution that you can get out of a camera like that, you have a lot of flexibility to crop, to print big, to change the aspect ratio of the image, to shoot in crop mode in the camera, or to crop later on. But the price that you pay is that with a pixel density that's that high, The high ISO performance is not so great. The noise that you get in the images is not so great if you have to shoot at higher ISOs. Now this camera, because the sensor is bigger than full frame, it's less of an issue. If you were to have 102 megapixels in a full frame sensor, the downsides that we see with the 61 megapixels on the A7R4, those downsides, the noise, that would be a bigger issue. So the resolution on this thing is very interesting. The second thing is the ergonomics are quite interesting. So what I'm talking about specifically is the viewfinder on this. So the electronic viewfinder here is tiltable. You can look straight down here or at any angle, like 45 degrees like that, and you can tilt it and you can lock it like this so that it doesn't move. Now the other thing that's interesting is that you can swivel the viewfinder, right? That is pretty interesting. Now, many of you may know that I'm a huge fan of shooting from a perspective down low. Like, often that means that you need to lie down on the ground to be able to shoot through the viewfinder like this. But with this viewfinder, you can be looking straight down. You can be kneeling on the ground. Now, some of you may be saying, well, okay, why don't you just put the camera down low and then use the tilt screen on the back? A lot of cameras have that tilt screen. The reason is that I use glasses when I'm looking at things that are up close, and I don't typically use my glasses in the field, and so when I look at the display, it's often not very clear to me. I typically do everything with the camera through the viewfinder, and I have the diopter set on the viewfinder. So that's why I always want to be looking through the viewfinder. And of course, also when the sun is really bright, sometimes it's hard to see the display on the back. So this tilting and pivoting or swivel viewfinder, that's a really interesting ergonomic feature. The other thing that I find interesting about this camera is that this sensor has a native aspect ratio of 4:3. Most of the cameras that we're used to, such as full frame cameras or APS-C cameras, are 3:2 aspect ratio. And many of you may know that I'm big on the idea of getting outside of your comfort zone and finding ways to force you to shoot differently. And shooting in a different aspect ratio is one way to do that. It's going to change the way you compose and change the way your images will look. Of course, we've had the 4:3 aspect ratio available as a native aspect ratio in Micro Four Thirds for a long time, but those sensors are typically around 20 megapixels. Now you've got like 102 megapixels in this 4:3 aspect ratio. So that's another reason I think that this is a fairly interesting system to consider, and that's why I started to look at it for wildlife photography. So let me tell you about 3 things that impressed me with this camera and with Fujifilm. This is the first system with a larger than full frame sensor that you can realistically bring into the field and use to photograph wildlife. That's amazing. The reason you can do that is that it has in-body image stabilization. So even though it's a very high resolution sensor and you're shooting with longer lenses, such as this 250mm lens, which is still, as I mentioned before, in full frame terms, really only about 200mm, although when you put the teleconverter on it, you're back sort of around, the 250mm mark, but of course we all know that is actually quite short compared to, say, 400, 500 or 600mm that we might typically use for wildlife photography. But still, it's usable for some kinds of wildlife photography. So the fact that you've got a long lens like that and this high resolution sensor, and it has in-body image stabilization, that makes using the system much more realistic where you are shooting handheld. The other thing is that it has autofocus that's pretty decent. It even has a tracking autofocus. All of these things make it possible to bring it into the field, and that's a first. The second thing is that regardless of whether or not this is right for anyone right now for wildlife photography, what's exciting about it is that it shows what's possible in the future. The idea that you could shoot in the field with 100 megapixels that's crazy. Already now we know with the 61 megapixels we're really enjoying the benefits of that on the Sony a7R IV, and we're looking at the possibility that in the future Canon might release, for example, a 70 or 80 megapixel sensor in a camera. We already see Canon has the EOS M6 Mark II that has 32 megapixels in an APS-C sensor, and if you extrapolate that out to full frame, it's more than the 61 megapixels in the Sony a7R IV. Now maybe we do have to go to a larger sensor than full frame in order to really to get a sensor that's that high resolution, such as 100 megapixels, but that is also practical to use in terms of noise, especially when we're shooting in wildlife photography scenarios where we might not always have the best light. But it's exciting to think about what is possible in the future. And the other thing that I'm really impressed by this is I'm impressed with what Fujifilm have done as a company to effectively leapfrog over full frame, because in their lineup they're traditionally known for having APS-C cameras in their X system lineup, and they don't have any full frame cameras. They went straight from APS-C, and they still are selling APS-C cameras and doing very well with them. They went straight from that to this kind of a system with a larger than full frame sensor, and that's exciting. And most of the manufacturers right now, Sony, Canon, Nikon, they're on full frame or on crop sensors sometimes, but most of what they're releasing is pretty iterative, and Fuji had the guts to go for something that's out of the box and that's quite different to what everyone else is doing. So I was very impressed overall by what they've achieved with this camera, and also what they're trying to do in terms of their business. Now let's talk about 3 things that I think really need to be improved to use this practically for wildlife photography. The first thing is one that's pretty obvious, and that is the availability of lenses. This is the longest lens that they have, this 250mm lens. And as I mentioned, even with the teleconverter on, you're really only shooting at 277mm in full frame terms. And also, when you have the teleconverter on, you're exposing with a maximum aperture of f5.6. So they could really benefit from having longer lenses, and I'm used to carrying around something that's substantially bigger than this, right? If you look at my 400 f2.8, my Sony camera, and then look at, by comparison, the Fujifilm with its long telephoto prime, it's substantially shorter. Now, interestingly, the weight is about the same, but the idea of, say, for example, having a 400 f4 or a 500 f5.6 on this system, that would make it a lot more appealing. So the lens selection is something that and to be clear, this is a new system. I'm already impressed with what they've managed to put out in such a short time. So it's just going to take some time. We'll see, however, whether or not they do end up releasing any longer lenses. Currently, if you look at the roadmap for the GF lenses, there are no other longer lenses that are planned right now. The second thing to talk about, and this is where I think it's definitely limiting to use this with wildlife photography, is the speed. So the speed right now is definitely something that can at times be frustrating, and that one needs to get used to. The burst rate on this camera is 5 frames per second. That's the highest burst rate, and when you're in that high burst rate mode, the delay in the viewfinder is quite noticeable. Also, there's quite a noticeable delay between pressing the shutter and taking that first shot, or any subsequent shots. And I missed shots as a result when I was using this, and it's just something that you really have to get used to. But it does certainly mean that if you're trying to shoot fast action like fast birds in flight or fast animals like cheetahs, this camera really wouldn't stand much of a chance. So the speed is something that really needs to be worked on. The other thing when we talk about speed is that, as expected, these files are huge. The size of the images are huge. And as many of you know, I use the iPad for most of my editing in the field, and the iPad is actually very fast compared to most computers in terms of processing images, in terms of getting them into Lightroom, in terms of rendering them, but I really noticed the time to get the images into Lightroom on the iPad and to render the images, and I'll show you what that looks like later on. The third thing that really needs some improvement is the battery life. This form factor with this battery grip that's part of it. This is not removable, by the way. This is the body as it is. It does have 2 batteries in it. I found I was able to go through the first battery pretty quickly. Yesterday I shot with this camera for about 5 hours, maybe not even 5 hours, maybe 4 hours, and not continuously, off and on in bursts. I was through the first battery in probably 2 or 3 hours, and then I kept topping it up. And I'll top it up a bit, and then I'd shoot with it a bit, and then it would deplete that battery again. And so a couple of times I ended up going on to the transferring automatically to the second battery. I could definitely see if I was to use it for a full day intensely, I would easily go through 2 batteries. So it would definitely be necessary to have a spare battery. So none of these things are really surprises. As I mentioned, this is a new system, so there's only a limited number of lenses right now, and they've actually done a great job to fill out the range, but I think longer lenses is something that's needed, and this is something that is also the case right now with the Fujifilm X system. They don't have much in terms of long telephoto primes. They have a 200 f2 and that's it. So really I'd like to see longer lenses, and the speed and the battery life, these are also things to be expected with a system like this, but these things can only get better. I'd like to now show you some images taken with the GFX100. Before doing that, I'm going to start by showing you some images taken with the Sony a7R IV. Why am I doing this? It's not necessarily to show you a comparison in terms of image quality, but it's to give you an idea of how much longer it might take when you are processing these images or rendering them in an app like Lightroom. To give you an idea of the relative file sizes, the images taken with the a7R IV are 60 megabytes in size. So let's look at some of these. Let's go in here and look at this image of this Nyala and zoom in, and there you go, fully rendered. Let's look at, say, this image of this bird, zooming in, and fully rendered. So it takes about 2 seconds to render these images in Lightroom on the iPad. Now let's look at some images taken with the GFX100. So these images are about 115 megabytes in size, so they're about twice as large. So let's look at this image of a squirrel and go right in. And what you'll find, generally what I find, is that it takes longer than twice as long. The files are twice as large, but it is taking, there you go, it rendered just now. Let's look at another image. Let's go right in here. So we're talking about maybe 10 seconds sometimes, and there you go, fully rendered. I found sometimes when I had imported a lot of images on the iPad, which definitely took longer to import those images than it would take to import images from the a7R IV. The time taken then to render, probably because my iPad was under a little bit of stress, which very rarely happens with this device, it was sometimes taking 20 seconds to render an image. So let's just try one more here, another squirrel. there you go, fully rendered. So you can see that these images have an incredible amount of detail, as you would expect. And in terms of the image quality, in terms of noise, for example, it's pretty similar to the A7R4, which is about what you would expect because the pixel density is about the same. Let's look at a few more images here. Let's look at some images here of these timber walls, these grey walls. Again, we can see how fast it renders in Lightroom on the iPad Pro. There you go, that's done. I think the images that would be most interesting to look at here are these images of these Arctic foxes, and in particular, these images that show that I was able to capture some action with this camera. It's not really a camera designed to capture action. That's not its forte, but it's possible. You're certainly not going to get the same kind of experience shooting action as you would something like the Sony A9 or A9 II. You will miss frames, you'll miss opportunities, but it's really just a different kind of experience. The burst rate is lower. There's definitely some delays in capturing the frames, and you're also not getting the same experience through the viewfinder as you get with something like the A9 or the A9 II. But it is possible. You just have to shoot a little bit differently, and you have to understand what the limitations of the camera are and work with those limitations. In return, you get some other things. You obviously get this much higher resolution, 100 megapixels, and you've also got the very interesting ergonomic setup with the viewfinder that you can tilt and you can swivel, and that definitely counts for a lot. So in all, I found it to be a great experience for photographing wildlife, but obviously if you shoot very fast birds in flight, or you shoot any kind of very fast action or sustained action, this camera definitely won't work for that. But if you only capture action every now and then, and most of these subjects you're shooting are slower, you really can get some good results with this camera. The resolution that I'm used to with the A7R4, as expected, I get that and more here, and the image quality in terms of the noise is about the same. So where do I stand in summary in terms of using this system for wildlife photography? Would I buy it? Would I replace some of the existing gear that I have? I would say, in short, not at this stage. However, it is exciting to think about the possibilities, and if they would get some longer lenses in the lineup, if the speed could be improved, if the battery life could be improved, I could see it as something that I might move to. However, I also think that the likelihood of moving to it and just using it exclusively, that is even more unlikely than the likelihood of using it at all. Because especially until the speed is as good as some of the other cameras that I'm using now, I would need other cameras to plug the gaps that this system can't address. So for example, one thing that comes to mind that could be interesting, and this is a bit of a crazy thought also, is the idea that you might create a kit that uses this camera and one or two of the lenses in this system alongside a micro four thirds camera. And interestingly, both of the systems have a 4:3 native aspect ratio. So imagine using this camera with, let's say, this 250mm lens, and in situations where you can do most of the photography with this camera and that lens, but occasionally when you really need the reach, you would turn to a micro four thirds camera with, say, something like the Olympus 300 f4, which is equivalent in full frame terms to a 600mm lens. That's an interesting idea. I know this is definitely not going to work for a lot of people because it just doesn't have the speed, it just doesn't have the reach, but I'm definitely going to keep an eye on what Fujifilm does with this system. I'm really excited by what it could mean for the future. And I will also say that overall, in terms of the experience of shooting with it, although I did have to compensate for the lack of speed, it was a very pleasant experience shooting with it. And it's incredible to see what you can get out of the images. So I hope you found this discussion helpful and interesting. Even if this is something that you might not be considering right now, I hope you'll agree that it's pretty cool to think about what they've done and what they might do with this system in the future. And if you have the opportunity to shoot with this system, I really encourage you to check it out, because it's pretty cool. And even just taking it out and using it to shoot some wildlife for a while, it just changes the way that you work. If you have any questions or comments, please post below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.